Great. Well, we warmly welcome all of you to this Dionysius Circle event. Today, we are honored to host Dr. Filip Ivanovic, a professor at the University of Montenegro. Dr. Ivanovic is a distinguished scholar of Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, or Pseudo-Dionysius, having published 2 books on the theologian. Today, we'll be discussing the first half of his recent 2019 book, published by Catholic University Press, Desiring the Beautiful, the Erotic-Aesthetic Dimension of Deification in Dionysius the Areopagite and Maximus the Confessor. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Ivanovic.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, our pleasure. So we'd like to just start off with a kind of a general question about the book. So what are your central aims what are the central aims of your book, Desiring the Beautiful? And then also more specifically, what are the aims of the first half of the book, which we will be focusing on in this discussion, the first half of the book that pertains to Dionysius?
Well, first of all, as I said, thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy and honored to be with you even in this virtual way. And I was very happy to receive your invitation, especially because I see that the number of friends of Dionysius is growing, and I'm very happy to see that there are scholars in different fields that are interested in his thought. As you have mentioned, Dionysius basically occupies quite a big portion of my research, and I started being interested in the Areopagite thought already during my undergraduate studies, because I was mainly interested in Greek philosophy. So I liked the ideas and the concepts that were treated and discussed in Greek antiquity. But then I stumbled upon some early Christian writings, and I stumbled also upon a bit old but still important book written by Basil Tatakis, which has a title Byzantine Philosophy. So it was originally published in French some 70 years ago, but there are many editions, many translations in English as well. So there I could find some things that did inspire me and did interest me in terms of the concepts and ideas that were present in ancient Greek philosophy, but were somehow enriched by something else. And that something else was the, well, let's say theology, but in fact, the ideas and concepts of God. So how do these things, so Greek philosophy from the one side and Christian faith on the other, how do they interact, and how did the Greek philosophy influence the formation of main Christian dogmas and ideas? Those were the things that I was very much interested in. And somehow Dionysius the Areopagite seemed to be a perfect example of that kind of synergy, let's say. As we all know, he is an anonymous writer, so we still don't know, although there have been some attempts to identify him, but we still don't know, and there is a probability that we will never know exactly who he actually was. But he was obviously very well versed in philosophy. He most probably attended the the academy. But on the other hand, we can also say with some degree of certainty that he was a monk. So he was the one that combined in a very interesting way both Greek philosophy and Christian faith. So I started reading a lot about Dionysius, reading his works, and somehow he began to occupy a lot of my research interests. And this book that we will be discussing today is an important result of that research. But if we want to put it quite briefly, it is basically a comparative study of two of among the most famous and well-known early Christian thinkers, namely Dionysius the Areopagite and Maximus the Confessor. Maximus the Confessor is one of the most influential thinkers of that time. He was one of the most influential church fathers. Some of his ideas were accepted by the church as dogmas, and he was quite an heir to Dionysius. He very often cites Dionysius. He builds upon his ideas, and so on. The other thing is that both Dionysius and Maximus were very well versed in philosophy. So that's another aspect that that I was attracted to in both of those thinkers. So I tried to make a comparative study to see where they agree and where they disagree, if there are that kind of points in their thought. And I decided to do it through the study of three concepts: love, beauty, and deification. So love and beauty, they don't need a lot of introduction. I mean, they are not only the philosophical, and they are not only in the center of philosophical and theological preoccupations since antiquity to our days, but they are also part of our everyday lives. We think about love and beauty all the time. We think about how and why we fall in love. Why do we love someone? Why do we don't love someone? Is the person that we love beautiful to us? Is it ugly to other people? And so on and so on. So they are very pregnant and very important concepts that do not concern only with philosophy or theology or basically with academic research, but have an everyday importance. Deification is the third concept, which is, I might say, central in the, let's say, eastern part of Christianity. And it is a little bit a controversial concept, because it developed in the East, in the Eastern Roman Empire, that is in the Byzantine Empire. It became, through time, it became the central concept of Orthodox Christian teaching, but it didn't gain that kind of success in the West. And there were some ideas that the concept of deification was basically sort of an aberration of Eastern Christian thought, and that it was formed precisely under the influence of Greek pagan philosophy. We might think about Plato's world of ideas. We can think about the Neoplatonic flight of the soul, the union with the one, and so on. So there are many conceptions that could be similar to the concept of deification. However, Christian thinkers, they developed this concept further, gave to it certain theoretical basis, and I see in Dionysius and Maximus precisely two of the most important, let's say, consolidators of the very theory of deification. So these three concepts were not unknown to the research community. Of course, there has been a lot of things written about these concepts, but I wanted to do two things. So first thing was, as I said, to see how Dionysius and Maximus, let's say, work together. And second thing was to see how these two very important, both philosophically and in our everyday lives, concepts such as love and beauty interact with this central idea of deification. So those were the main aims of the book, and they are actually exemplified in the very title of the book, Desiring the Beautiful. I took that from both Plato and from Dionysius. They both talk about love for the beautiful or desire for the beautiful. And the subtitle, I decided purposefully to use the word erotic because I wanted to shock a little bit someone who could see the title and didn't perhaps understand what the book could be about, because in our days, in our modern societies, erotic has a very different connotation than it had in antiquity and in the Middle Ages. So I tried to do it, so to say, to revitalize and rehabilitate the concept of eros and the concept of erotic, even within this philosophical and theological discourse. So that would be a sort of a introduction into the aims of the book.
Great, thank you for that very helpful introduction. As you mentioned, as you just mentioned, you know, that Dionysius is a powerful combination of Greek philosophical thinking and then Christian thinking. But one point where Dionysius does provide a kind of innovation is in respect to his notion of the four different kinds of love or kinds of erotic movement. So would you mind describing these four different erotic movements? And then also, could you perhaps touch on how Dionysius unifies these four movements into the idea that God himself is actually this one eternal circular movement of love? And for this question, I was also thinking I would share my screen here this is from your book. And here we have listed the four different erotic movements.
Yes, let me just give a very brief introduction into the research of eros. There were ideas that were quite dominant, let's say, in the mid of the 20th century, that eros was a specifically Greek pagan thing, and that the Christian concept of love was agape. And there was a very famous book written by Anders Nygren, who was a Swedish scholar, entitled precisely Eros and Agape, where he painstakingly tried to show how agape was the main dominant concept in Christianity, while Eros is kind of a pagan thing that goes back to Greek philosophy. And if we think it like that, in these clear-cut divisions between philosophy and theology, or between Greek antiquity and Christianity, then we would fail to understand many of Christian thinkers, including Dionysius the Areopagite. Dionysius perhaps was perhaps not the first, I'm not sure, but definitely the one who was the first to talk about eros abundantly, and who actually, I think, tried to remedy this sort of distinction that began already in the first centuries of Christianity, that agape was the Christian concept of love and that eros is to be left to the Greeks. So what he did here is that he talks all the time about eros, and most probably he also thought to identify eros and agape, that is to make them synonymous. So his main preoccupation was to talk about eros, and he really talks about eros a lot. So the scheme of the erotic movements that you mentioned and that we can see on the screen, that appears in the Divine Aims, the famous treaty written by Dionysius. And there he argues precisely that all things love and desire the good and the beautiful. So because of the good and the beautiful, the subordinate is returned to the superior. That's the eros epistreptikos. The equals are kept in a communion. That is perhaps the best translation. That's the eros kinonikos. Kinonia is communion. Superiors, they turn to their subordinates providentially, and that's the eros pronoitikos. And each thing bestirs itself. That's the eros synektikos, which we can also say it is eros of conservation, of self-preservation. Basically, it's when we hear that quite a lot. You cannot love other person if you don't love yourself. So this would be this love for yourself, but not in terms of some sort of egoism or whatever. But it is a genuine good love that you have for yourself, for the preservation of your own person, let's say. So this is the fourth type of eros synektikos, which is the way in which each thing loves itself. The first and the third, the epistreptikos and pronoitikos eros, these types can also be noticed in Proclus. But providence, providential care, it is applied to gods that are in lower strata, so that are lower or inferior to the one, but not to the one itself. And interestingly, the term eros does not appear in Proclus's theological works, which is precisely the term that Dionysius would later combine or pair with providence. And this is actually what plays a role in Proclus's theology. So what I'm saying is that there is providence in Proclus's theology, but it is not paired with eros in a way that Dionysius does it. So it would mean that Proclus does not ascribe providential love to the one, but he ascribes it to inferior gods. And in fact, there is a sentence by Proclus that means that he somehow criticizes Christians for ascribing providential love to God and do not believe in lesser gods. There is a further step made by Dionysius in his description of Eros and the erotic movement, is that Dionysius characterizes Eros pronoitikos, Eros kinonikos, and Eros epistreptikos as ecstatic. So he gives them an ecstatic character. So that's a very important thing, because according to that idea, love is characterized by one's going out of oneself. It happens when the lover does not belong to the self, but belongs to the beloved one. So ecstasis, ecstasis, would mean that you are going out of your place, out of your position. Of course, it can be understood as a quite paradoxical thing, because it would mean that you are, if we want to give it a plastic description, it means that you are sitting or standing in the same place, but somehow yourself is going out of you, or out of your body, so to say. And this is a very important step in Dionysius, because we didn't have this kind of love's character before applied to God. So Dionysius does not apply the ecstatic character of love only to created things, but to God as well. And it would mean that as a human being goes out of himself or herself to belong to God, so does God go out of himself in his loving care for everything. And we can remember a quote from Dionysius, which is a very beautiful quote, I think, when he says, he is as it were, beguiled by goodness, by love, and by yearning, and is enticed away from his transcendent dwelling place and comes to abide within all things. So if we think about it, this sentence, if we put it out of the context, if we see just this sentence somewhere, we could think of that a writer is describing a loving relationship between the two lovers. We wouldn't really assume that it is the relationship between God and human being, but we would say here is a description of two lovers being in love. So it is a very precious sentence that is given by Dionysius, which I wanted to emphasize. However, all these types of love are actually one and the same, and this one and the same is an eternal circle of love which unifies all things with each other and with God. So if we want to, let's say, summarize, we would say that eros as love is a characteristic of both God and the created beings, and it operates, let's say, operates in or moves in different ways. So there is this love that subordinates give to the superior. So, for example, human being gives their love to God. There is the one that goes, let's say, from above downwards. So that would be the love of God, who loves his creation, who loves human beings and animals and basically creation, the totality of his creation. That would be the pronoitikos. The other movement of love is among equals. That would be, let's say, love thy neighbor, the brotherly love. So when you love all of your fellow human beings, and this self-preservational love, which means love of oneself. However, these are not four different, so to say, kinds of love. Those are just different denominations, let's say, of one and the same eternal circle of love, which of course has its source in God. We can also think about it in the terms of procession and conversion. So God proceeds towards the creation whose vehicle is love, and the creation returns to the source, to God, again through love, which is the vehicle of that kind of conversion. And a very important thing to note here, why is love so important? Of course, it's not important just in itself, because it's a good thing. But for Dionysius, it is important because it, let's say, it underlines the reciprocity of the relationship between God and human being. And we could say, as much God reveals himself lovingly to the humankind, that much human beings are again lovingly ascended to God. And this ascension, which then could end into in a union with God, which would be precisely deification. And again, love, or eros as such, is the vehicle of the two central motives of Christianity: incarnation and deification. Incarnation is God becomes a human being, so he descends downwards to the creation, and deification is the ascent of created things towards God. All of this is operated by love, and it cannot be done without love. That's the central idea and central point that Dionysius wants to make, and it also continues in Maximus and so on.
Great, thank you for that very clear exposition. I think I think Carson had a question about the relationship between Dionysius and Neoplatonism on this issue of love, if you wanted to take it, Carson.
Yeah, so thank you, Professor, for being with us. I guess one question that comes up is it seems that this circular movement of love on the global level is just Neoplatonism. Dionysius speaks about God moving in an eternal circle, remaining, proceeding, and reverting, where the proceeding and the returning involve creating the world and bringing the world back to himself. When I was looking at all those passages, I was wondering why there's no mention really of the Trinity in terms of this movement of proceeding and returning. It seems to be couched in terms of moving out into creation. So that's one aspect that you might think it's more of a Neoplatonic story. So I guess the general question is, in what ways is Dionysius' account of love in terms of God's love Neoplatonic, or in what ways is there a Christian corrective?
Yes, well, you mentioned one thing that has been more or less in the center of the debate about Dionysius and about his about whether he is, let's say, genuinely Christian or he is just a Neoplatonist, and there was a very this is a bit of an excursus. There was a very interesting article by an Italian scholar published quite some years ago, who argued that Dionysius was basically a Neoplatonist, Damascus, as he had identified him as Damascus, the last scholar of the School of Athens, who tried to let's say destroy Christianity from within. So he wrote the corpus. He presented it as written by the famous Dionysius the Areopagite, so that he would gain authority and recognition, and so that he would insert Neoplatonist and pagan elements into Christian religion and attempt to destroy it from the inside. So that's it's a bit forced, but it's a very interesting hypothesis. And indeed, there is not much mention of the Trinity. But as I wrote on a different subject in the book, those were not very easy times when we suppose Dionysius wrote his corpus, and there were many controversies. One of those controversies was the monophysitism and so on. And perhaps it was also wise, perhaps, to avoid certain ideas that might put you on one on the other side in these controversies. One of those controversies was, as I said, about the nature of Christ. The other one was precisely about the Trinity, and so on and so on. So perhaps Dionysius was trying to safeguard his authority and his position, and not to give any material that could be put on one on the other side of the debates. However, when we talk about love, again, Dionysius is here, like in many other aspects of his thought, showing a skillful combination of Christian faith with the Neoplatonic philosophical inheritance. So I cannot say precisely whether his notion or concept of love is better or superior to the Neoplatonic view, but it does build upon those views, and it enriches those views with some, let's say, ingredients. among those ingredients are, as I said, ascribing providential love to God, and characterizing love, including God's love, which is important, as ecstatic. So I think it would be quite unusual and perhaps even blasphemous within Neoplatonic circles to describe God's actions as ecstatic, to think that the one goes out of itself in providential love. But while Dionysius is keen on affirming God's loving presence in all things, he is also keen on preserving his transcendence. So while God's love can be seen, felt, or understood in the world and in all things, because God goes out of himself and gives himself to them, he nevertheless remains within himself. So there lies a mystery and perhaps the impossibility for us to comprehend how exactly can God in the same time go out of himself but still remain within himself. And there is an expression that Dionysius uses when he talks about these things, and that is the expression super essential power. So this super essential power of God is what preserves God's transcendence and points to the idea that he is not a thing or not a being, but he is, as written in the Bible, all in all. So obviously, there are many Neoplatonic elements in his thought. There is a lot of Greek inheritance in his thought. One of those inheritances is precisely the term eros, as I said. So he's rarely using the term agape, which was quite dominant in those times to describe Christian love. But he is using the pagan philosophical concept of eros, builds upon it, and adds some other things that are not Neoplatonic, but can be viewed as indeed Christian.
Thank you. I was wondering...
and one more thing.
Sure.
When we talk about these things, we should always remember that in Christianity there are three persons in the Trinity. So Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are persons. So all that goes, all these actions of God are, so to say, personal. They go to persons. While in the Neoplatonic philosophy, we cannot really infer that kind of relationship that exists between God or gods and the creation. While in Christianity it does, and I think that Dionysius does have this kind of idea in the back of his head that the Trinity is personal, that it is the personal God who communicates with a personal human being, so to say.
Thank you. I was wondering in that regard, when you talk about the person, if this issue of the Logoy in God, which he uses to create beings through his will, might get at some of that personal aspect. I mean, I know the will is common to the three persons, but it seems like with this idea that God chooses to deploy the Logoy of beings into creation, if we can say that that is identical to this movement of love, which is eternal, which he says is eternal through, from, and in the good. He uses these prepositions about love. That would seem to me like a strong contrast with Neoplatonism. So I guess the question is, can we identify this circulation of love that goes from God all the way to the lowliest parts of creation and returns with the creation in accordance with the Logoy? And if we can, and creation in accordance with the Logoy requires a distinction between will and essence, it seems like there might be a contradiction in Dionysius between what looks like a Neoplatonic circulation of love that's just automatic versus a choice to create. So I was wondering maybe if you could comment on that.
Yeah, well, when we talk about Logoy, those are, as defined, I think, precisely by Dionysius, as predeterminations of God's will. And it is very similar to what Maximus the Confessor will use later. He was very famous for his theory of the Logoy. So these predeterminations, they do, in fact, have to do also with individual will of the created being. So let me explain in a more plastic way as I understand it. For example, you have logos when you were created by God that you should become a doctor, a medical doctor. But it is up to you if you are going to act in accordance with that logos or you are going to go contrary to that logos. And the decision whether you are going to act in accordance or against the logos depends on your free will. So not all beings, not all created beings fulfill their logos, and not all of them act in accordance with their logos. Many of them go against the logos, and that is something that Maximus, for example, dwells a lot on. But when we talk about what happens in God when He creates, does He create out of necessity, or He creates out of freedom, and how these things are working with the idea of love. Again, there has been a debate when it comes to Dionysius, and not even in Dionysius, but in general, we can speak about the tension or the relationship between freedom and necessity when it comes to creation. So there is one phrase in the divine names that says the yearning, the eros, which creates all the goodness of the world, pre-existed superabundantly within the good and did not allow it to remain without issue. So you can see in this phrase, this part did not allow, that can make some confusion, because if we say that this did not allow it to remain without issue, it would mean that God cannot not produce. It would seem that He would be compelled to produce. So how can we understand it? This part did not allow. So we can think of it in again in everyday terms. So if I tell you you are not allowed to go outside, it means that you can go outside, but I am not allowing it. So similarly, if we say it is not allowed to hurt someone, it implies that people actually can hurt someone, and they actually do it every day, although it is forbidden. So in these two examples, it would seem that there is some sort of a higher authority or law. It doesn't matter if it is a person, a law, a judge, police, whatever, but a higher authority or law that does not allow certain things to be done, although those certain things can be done. So if we apply this kind of thinking to God, it would be a paradox, because it would mean that there is an authority higher than God, or a law that is above God, which would allow or not allow God to do this or that. So I think that this utterance did not allow should be understood in a rhetorical way. So not in a way of some alternatives or higher authorities or a law that is above God, but in a sense that God acts in accordance with him being God, that is in accordance with his nature, and that he, let's say, bounds himself by goodness and love because he wants it so. God, in fact, can do everything. So he can do harm, he can do good, he can create, or he can decide not to create, but he wills to create and wills to do good. There are also passages in the Bible where he is, so to say, threatening to Israel and metaphorically saying that he can destroy Israel. So he can do also bad things. He can do harm, but he doesn't do those things. And let me point to another thing, which is not so much related to Dionysius. This kind of debate, whether God can do everything, or he cannot really do everything, or he is bound by some sort of a necessity, or whatever, that has been a very long debate, especially in Western hemisphere, where some philosophers and theologians came up with the distinction of potentia absoluta and potentia ordinata. So potentia absoluta, if we want to translate it literally, it would be absolute power, but absolute power in terms God can do whatever. And potentia ordinata, or ordained power, which says, no, the power of God is in some sort, somehow limited. So by potentia absoluta, God can do everything, but by potentia ordinata, he does only good things. But he does good things because he wants to do good things. He acts fully in accordance with his will and with his nature. And his nature is only goodness, love, and so on. His nature is not to harm, to do bad things, and so on and so on. By the way, this kind of distinction had quite some political implications during the reign of, was it Henry VIII, the one that created the Anglican Church when the separation between Rome and England happened, because he wanted the Pope to give him blessing for his, I think, third marriage, which was forbidden by the canons. The Pope refused. So the king told the Pope, yes, but you can imitate God, you can imitate Christ, and by the potentia ordinata, you cannot give me the blessing, but by potentia absoluta, you could give me the blessing. So he made even a theological argument for that. Of course, he was denied that kind of blessing, and the rest is history. So I'm saying that these ideas and this debate is not important only for us. It was important also in previous centuries, in early Christianity, in the East and in the West, and it also had some political implications. So these are not things that can be easily resolved or explained.
Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Sam now.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think, Marcus, did you have a follow-up related to the issue of creation there?
Yes. So, Professor, you mentioned this argument in your book, argument that Eric Pearl makes, that if we discuss God's free or necessary creation, that there's the danger of treating God anthropomorphically. That if we say God has to create or has some freedom to choose between possible options like creating or not creating, then we are assuming that there's something prior to God, either some law of necessity or some pre-given possibilities. You seem to think that that argument is correct to some extent in your book, but you also argue, as you just said, that God might not have created, or he could do harm instead of doing good if he'd wanted to. So my question is, how do you, I guess, reconcile those two ideas, that God might not have created, or he could have done harm instead of good, without assuming some prior set of possibilities that he himself is not the source of, if that makes sense?
Well, you see, like with the previous question and my discussion of the previous question, I think many of these issues that we encounter and we think about come, of course, from our natural curiosity and and our need to rationally explain things. That's, of course, completely natural and good, but sometimes it leads to apply, as you mentioned, that I write in the book, certain anthropomorphic characteristics to God. So if we think about the freedom or necessity to create, we can think of quite a lot of analogies, because this is always around us. It's in our minds, it's in our talk, in our everyday life. So, for example, I can choose whether I will create or make a chair or prepare dinner. Preparing dinner is also a type of creation. And artist or a writer often says, we hear that from time to time, I am compelled, I feel the urge or I feel the need to paint a painting or write a novel. Or let's go even further and imagine, for example, that you are hungry, you are starving, and all you have in front of you are let's say potatoes, but you don't like potatoes. So you can choose not to eat them, but still you would probably choose to eat them because it will satisfy your hunger. Again, on a different example similar to this, if I invite you to dinner and we eat the main course and I ask you what would you like for dessert, would you like a chocolate cake or an apple pie, you can choose between the alternatives according to your taste. So you would not choose out of hunger, but you would choose out of your preference or according to your taste. So there are many situations which we can think of and which we encounter on a daily basis. So can we apply this way of thinking to God? I guess to some extent. For example, God creates the world. Could he have chosen not to create it? Yes. Did he have in front of him a set of options like that chocolate cake or that apple pie to choose from? No. So God could have been there without this world. This world and all things in it might not have been. And this is the essential characteristic of God's creation. He does not create because he is compelled by something to do it. He does not create because of his superabundant essence. That's a very common, very frequent expression, superabundant essence, which somehow overflows out of him. And so that the result of that superabundance is creation. But he creates out of love. He gives himself freely. He wills good, so he does good. He loves, so he acts in a loving way. And he simply need not deliberate over one thing or the other like we often do. So the main point of all this is that God is not in front of the dilemmas in front of which we find ourselves. He doesn't need to, or not doesn't need, but he doesn't choose between chocolate cake and apple pie. He does things in accordance with his nature and his will. So what I'm saying is that he did not have alternatives in front of him in sense, you can create this kind of world or you can create that kind of world. He simply created a world that he chose to create, and that's it. So I think that it's often good to do it like that, but I think that we also often, as I said, exaggerate or try to overthink things, because of course we have a need to understand things. We want things to be explained, but when it comes to these kinds of concepts, like we have in Byzantine thought, in Christian thought, when which deal with God and so on, some things you simply cannot comprehend. And it's not just freedom and necessity of creation. It's also those basic concepts of Dionysius, like the unknown knowing or the cloud of darkness and so on. Those are all things that that cannot be easily grasped and explained. So those would be my thoughts about this.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I'll ask one more question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience, see if anyone would like to ask something. But just so you mentioned these issues that kind of exceed our understanding, but you also discussed the ways in which God kind of concedes to us or lovingly approaches or concedes to our limited nature. And so specifically, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about or unpack the meaning and importance of Dionysius's idea of sacred veils. As you explain, God lovingly veils himself basically in sensible things so that humanity might be illumined. And you quote one of my favorite passages from Dionysius from the Celestial Hierarchy, I think the first chapter. Dionysius says that the divine ray can enlighten us only by being upliftingly concealed in a variety of sacred veils, which the providence of the Father adapts to our nature as human beings. Yeah, so could you maybe just explain a little bit this idea of sacred veil, and especially maybe in connection to the Divine Liturgy or the Mass, with its beauty, odors, light, and of course, the Eucharist. So.
Yeah, well, this expression "sacred veils" it's very beautiful and it's very interesting, and it's thought-provoking. To put it simply, the sacred veils are biblical and liturgical symbols by which God reveals himself to us, to human beings. These symbols, so to say, represent a meeting point between God's absolute transcendence and his immanence in the world. Those are also two things that are that occupy quite a lot of space in Dionysius. So at the same time, God is transcendent, unknowable, ungraspable, untouchable, and so on. But still, he is present in the world and in all things as a creator in his creation. So the symbols through which God manifests himself are sort of a concession to our nature, because our nature is composite. We are all we all consist of both soul and body. We have intellectual, but also material, physical side. So the transcendent, the absolutely transcendent God, he reveals himself through the material things. And so that's why Dionysius says, I'm going to quote just a second. Yeah, he says, it is quite impossible that we humans should in any immaterial way rise up to imitate and to contemplate the heavenly hierarchies without the aid of those material means capable of guiding us as our nature requires. So basically here Dionysius explains the function of sacred veils and of material things. So we as human beings that are physical and material, we have our bodies, we have our senses, we see, we touch, we taste, we hear, need those kinds of material things that could guide us to God. So if we want to be very simple, it means that God is actually speaking our language. So he is speaking our language to guide us to him. The function of those things, material things, symbols, is both pedagogical and anagogical, because these things are images of the imageless, of those things that don't have an image. So they are pedagogical because they teach humans about God. That is how humans learn about God. And centuries later, for example, during the iconoclastic controversy, when there has been this kind of basically a war between icon worshippers and iconoclasts, or the destroyers of icons, and when many icons were destroyed, forbidden, and so on, quite a lot of Dionysian ideas were used to justify icon worshipping. And what I wanted to say within this pedagogical function of material things, there has been an idea that icons, for example, are the Bible for the illiterate. So the frescoes and the icons and so on, depicting various saints, Christ, Mary, different events from the Bible. They are there so that people can learn, even if they cannot read the Bible. So it's one aspect of the pedagogical function of material symbols. The anagogical, the uplifting function is because through learning and interpreting the sacred veils, humans ascend, they are uplifted to God, and they realize that they need to go beyond simple appearances, beyond mere perception, because there is something much higher than the material things. However, there's also a third function to these veils, and that's why they are called veils, because they also have the function to conceal their true meaning from, let's say, uninitiated people. So when we put those things together, the visible world both reveals and conceals the divine. And in fact, as you mentioned, Dionysius dedicates a lot of space precisely to the interpretation of different aspects of sacraments, discussing the Eucharist, the baptism, the funeral rites, and so on and so on, and explains the meaning of different symbols in those rites. So as he also writes, he explains how the material light, the light of this world, is an image of immaterial light. The Eucharist is a symbol of participation in Christ, etc., etc. But to fully benefit from these symbols, from these material things, we must uncover the veils. And by uncovering the veils, we rise up to God, who is, of course, hidden. But if he is hidden, he is not absent. So he reveals himself to the world through perceptible things, colors, scents, sounds, or if we want to say with one word, through the beauty of this world. And this idea was quite powerful in whole of Christianity, and it had a very eminent place in Byzantium, and it initiated something that's called material mysticism. Again, a paradoxical expression, material mysticism, but it points to the need of the Byzantines to adorn their churches with a lot of different colors, a lot of different materials, to put icons, to put frescoes, and so on and so on. So these materials, these images, these perceptible things were not there and are not there. Still, the churches are quite adorned in Christianity. They are not there put randomly. Everything, every color, every material, it points to something. So what it is that it points to let's say, higher world, the world where God dwells. And this is an idea that is present already in Plato, then the Neoplatonists, and of course it receives a quite intense meaning with Christianity, and that's the flight to the heaven, to put it simply, or the idea that the true homeland of human being are the heavens, not the earth. So everything that happens here on earth, it somehow points to this higher world in the heavens.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just seems like a very important concept for understanding the sacramental life of the church. And but does anyone within the audience happen to have any questions for Professor Ivanovic? Connor,
really quickly, I wanted to thank you, Professor, for your book and for your love for Dionysius and Maximus. It's a good thing for me to see and to aspire to. So I appreciate it. And thank you guys for the invite. Fortunately have to run, so I'll see you. But take care.
Well, thanks for coming, Connor. Yeah,
Thank you.
God bless you. Yeah. Does anyone happen to have any questions or?
I had sort of a follow-up question on the Logoy. Do you think that the Logoy are just the one, or just simple unity in God, and they only become diversified in the act of creation? I think this is Eric Pearl's view. Or are the Logoi distinct in God prior to creation, such that he creates in accordance with them? That second option is what seems to give people a lot of worries, and they start squirming, because if the Logoi of beings are distinct in God's mind prior to the creation of the world, that supposedly creates this issue of anthropomorphism or ontotheology, because it puts God in relation to something else. I was wondering if you just had an opinion on that. I know Tollefson has an article on Philoponus and his critique of Proclus on an eternal world, where Tollefson says that basically Maximus, the Confessor's view, agrees with Philoponus against Proclus in such a way that God could have the Logoi of beings in his mind prior to creation, without that leading to these difficulties that Proclus points to. And I think Philoponus has like ways of arguing that it's not a problem. It doesn't make God relative or have to go through a motion to create. But I was just wondering your opinion on that. Are the Logoi distinct in God prior to creation?
Well, I would say that they are. And I think that if now I think about it, perhaps this idea that they are not distinct in God, but that they become distinct afterwards, I guess that might solve some problems, but it could also create new ones. And I'm not sure that there is a problem if these logoi are distinct in God prior to creation, because I don't see that there is this kind of necessary ontological link between the creator and the creation if logoi are distinct in God. If you want, you can elaborate further and let me know what in what way is this connected, as I don't see why it would be necessary for it to be so.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there would just be Neoplatonic worries about distinctions in the one. I mean, I guess that would be to speak very generally.
Yeah, I get that, but I think that with the Christian concept of God, so to say, we are past that kind of problem.
Right. The thing is, it does show up in Dionysius, I believe, in the text, where I think he does in places talk about how the logoi pre-exists uniformly, or they pre-exist in the mode of unity or something like that, which might lead you to...
Yeah, there is this. He says that explicitly, that that's why they are predeterminations, so they are they pre-exist in God. So obviously he's also differentiating himself from that kind of stance that that you mentioned. And again, if there is, as there is in Christianity, the ontological gap between God and the creation, the very fact that logoi pre-exist and are predetermined in God does not create that kind of problem. It would create if we imagine the one and the superabundance of essence, as I said, and this superabundance overflows, and so these particles, let's say, of this essence become creation. So that would create a clear ontological link between the two. And I'm not sure, I think it's Plotinus that in his idea, it doesn't have to do much with the concrete thing, but our question. But it is the when it comes to eros, for example, the Plotinian soul has an innate eros for the good. The good is the soul's beloved thing. For the Christians and as well as for Dionysius, there is no this insurance, ontological insurance of the return, because the soul is not ontologically linked to God, but it is created. Human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. So that's a different thing. It's a different kind of creation, so to say.
Thank you. I've got, I mean, there's all sorts of questions that arise. I guess we've been going for a while. Sam, do you want to say any final things?
Oh, well, just thank you so much, Dr. Ivanovic, for coming and generously answering our questions. It's been a real delight to speak with you.
I thank you once again for the invitation, and I hope that you will have a fruitful work with the Dionysius Circle, and I wish you all the best, and also in your individual research.
Great, thank
So
you.
thank you again.
Thanks for coming.
And I also
Thank-
might mention, I noticed Demetrius Paulus joined us today, and I might just mention that on the 14th of July, we will be having a discussion with him on the reception of Dionysius in modern Greek theology. So, so thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Dr.
That's right. Thanks a lot for the invitation
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, it's
to me
good to
as
see you.
well. I have a question for Philip, if there is still time. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I was wondering, Professor Ivanovic, there is a passage in John of Damascus. I think you have also worked on John, where John uses the incarnation as an argument for the relevance of material, speak of materialistic mysticism that you mentioned. And I think it's the third treatise on the images. And I wonder if there is something similar in Maximus the Confessor, or, well, to put it explicitly, John says that humans have a greater knowledge of God because of the incarnation and because of their participation in the Eucharist. And in this way, he also justified the use of images and the icons on the part of the Christians. So do you think that there is something similar in the Eucharistic or the semiotic theory of Maximus the Confessor, or even in Dionysius the Areopagite, at least implicitly? Because in Dionysius,
Yes,
you know, there is a distinction between immaterial and material beings, and I think that the celestial world has a deeper knowledge, in a sense.
Yes, I'm aware of that. And I think that when you talk about John of Damascus, I think you are referring to the fact to the part when he says, "I venerate matter because of the one who became matter for my sake." There is this passage that is explicitly invoking, so to say, incarnation as an argument for the icon veneration, because one of the arguments against it was that it was a material thing, and that no immaterial thing can be, let's say, contained in the matter. But then he said, well, God himself incarnated, he became flesh, he became matter for my own sake, so that is why I give my reverence to the matter. There are similar things in Dionysius and Maximus. Unfortunately I don't have the exact quotations, but there is part in Dionysius where he talks about the body as, let's say, a lesser beauty, so perhaps, so not evil, not irrelevant, very much relevant, and also beautiful, but obviously not as beautiful as the intelligible things. And a further proof, let's say, towards that kind of conclusion is this part in Dionysius' writings where he talks about the funeral rites, because he describes what kind of things are done also to the body of the deceased. So the body of the deceased, as well as the body of the living person, has a very important role in the whole process, and for both Dionysius and Maximus, and I think that's basically the core of the tradition also in other thinkers. When it comes to deification, you are not deified only as a mind or as a soul, but you are deified as a complete person, as a complete nature of both soul and the body. So I think there is a generally positive attitude towards the body and towards the matter in not just in Dionysius or Maximus or John of Damascus, but I think that is like a mainstream in Byzantine philosophy and theology, that there is a positive appreciation of the body.
Actually, I found the passage, and it says that God grants humans a fuller knowledge of and communion with Him than the angels, because they lack of the material body of God in the incarnation, in Christ. I found a similar idea in my research in the work of Stithatos, Nikita Stithatos, and then in Gregory Palamas.
In Palamas as well.
Yes, and I think that you're absolutely right. There is a continuum in the patristic tradition. So could we say that there is a flourishing of the patristic thought, and Dionysius is part of it, as you suggested, of course?
I didn't catch the last the question. Sorry.
So I think that Nikita Stithatos and then Palamas used John of Damascus to develop a Eucharistic and materialistic theology, let's say. And I think you're right that St. Dionysius is part of that continuum. Could we say that there is a flourishing, a development of patristic thought, and Dionysius developed it metalinguistic, let's say, in a different language of the same experiences and practices within the patristic tradition?
Yes, I think that's a very good assumption, and that it is correct. And obviously, I mean, when we talk about Dionysius, it's always how am I going to say that? I appreciate what you said just a little bit earlier, how he has perhaps different language. So it is true that Dionysius differs with his kind of expression, with his kind of writing and terminology and so on. But I think that he can be fully inserted into this kind of continuity that we can say goes from the early centuries up until Gregory Palamas and other thinkers. And I also found that I was trying to search on my computer for keywords, and I found this passage that I was thinking about of John of Damascus. He says, "I do not venerate matter, I venerate the fashioner of matter, who became matter for my sake and accepted to dwell in matter, and through matter worked my salvation, and I will not cease from reverencing matter through which my salvation was worked." So again, a very important thing, because he says, it is through matter that my salvation was worked. And it is similar to what Dionysius says. You cannot be uplifted without the material things, without these sacred veils that we were discussing earlier. So obviously, the material things and matter itself has a very important role in the whole of this tradition.
I think that the Dionysian corpus is much more Christocentric than it has often been thought of. Especially in the beginning of the celestial hierarchy, when it begins with a reference to the Father. Every good light comes from God the Father, and right after it refers to Christ. So it's through Christ that all these, let's say, epistemologies developed. I would like you to say something on that or explain. I think you mentioned some very interesting things with regards to materiality and how there is a sort of a pedagogy of the sensible.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you. I think that there were some interpretations of Dionysius that downplayed a little bit Christocentricity of his thought, and Christology has very often been mentioned as something missing in Dionysius. And of course, it's not perhaps as developed as we would like it to be. But the very fact that that his main preoccupation is deification, and that the other side of the coin of deification is incarnation, that puts Christ in the central place of Dionysius' thought. And there is always this talk about achieving likeness, imitating Christ, and so on. So obviously, he did have it in mind. Perhaps he didn't feel the need to elaborate certain things. He perhaps had a bit different preoccupations. But I think that it's quite all right. I mean, in his thought, we do find the centrality of Jesus, as well as in the most important part of his thought, which is deification.
Yeah, I was wondering in connection with that, if you agree that there's a Christological reference. Do you remember the passage where it's talking about the word eros and why some people wouldn't like to use that word? And I think he says something like they have a false image of yearning, or most people have a false understanding of that word, and they require, I think he says, the divine wisdom to lift them up and remove their ignorance. And once the ignorance is removed, they understand that the word eros is appropriate. When he says divine wisdom there, it seems to point to the fact that there needs to be the incarnation to correct the human movement, which is not properly erotic. I don't know if you remember that passage. I can't remember exactly where it is, but
vaguely I do, but and I'm now trying to again do some keyword search.
I think
but
it's
I'm not
4:12 or somewhere.
Is that where he also cites Irenaeus, who says, "My Eros is crucified"?
I think it's
Possibly referring to Christ.
I think it's in that same area. Yeah, sorry, it's just sort of a passing question. I thought.
Yes, he says, "Let us not fear this title of yearning, nor be upset by what anyone has to say about these two names. For in my opinion, the sacred writers regard yearning and love as having one and the same meaning."
Right.
Yearning meaning eros, and love meaning that's what I was saying, that Dionysius himself took the task of making these two terms synonymous, because obviously already in that period when he was writing, although he is trying to present himself as contemporary to Christ, but obviously in those centuries when he was actually writing the corpus, eros was more and more applied to the Greek philosophical, meaning pagan, tradition, and agape was taking the place of meaning Christian love. So he's trying to say that this kind of attitude perhaps is wrong, and that there is nothing bad in the concept of eros, in the term eros. He's trying to reivindicate the positive aspects of the word.
Right, and it seems like it's at 709C. That's where.
Yeah.
709C. But it seems like he's saying how you're going to realize the true meaning is through the divine wisdom. I mean, he says in the Logoy, the fact is that men are unable to grasp the simplicity of the one divine eros, and hence the term is quite offensive to most of them. So it is left
I see, and
to lift them up and to raise them up. So I was wondering, is that an incarnation reference there, to go with Demetrios's point about the Christological?
Well, it could be, but I cannot be sure.
Yeah.
Because you mean this part, so it is left to the divine wisdom to lift them and to raise them up to a knowledge,
right,
of what yearning really is. I'm not sure. It could be Demetrios. What do you think?
I'm sorry, I didn't follow up this comment.
Okay.
So in the corpus, when Dionysius is talking about eros and love, and he's saying that some people think about eros as being only partial, physical, and so on. So he says the fact is that men are unable to grasp the simplicity of the one divine yearning, that is eros, and hence the term is quite offensive to most of them. So it is left to the divine wisdom to lift them and to raise them up to a knowledge of what yearning really is. So the question is whether the divine wisdom in this sentence can have Christological character.
Well, to be honest, the divine names is a very philosophical work, and we can't really be sure about many passages, including that. I don't know. I mean, there is also an originist background of that treatise that would leave many things open to discussion. I don't know.
So perhaps it's better to leave it at this point.
Well, yeah. What I remember well is that in the same section, he stresses that we should not stick to words, but we should focus on the power of the meanings of the words. Exactly, and that's it. It's is precisely where he identifies eros with agape. And of course, he extends Gregory of Nyssa and perhaps even earlier patristic thought. May I ask something about Platonism and Dionysius? We had some discussion earlier about it. Are we sure that Dionysius was directly connected with the Academy of Athens?
I don't think we are sure, but
many scholars stress that he was a member of the Academy, you know, Stephen Gerrits and others. But it seems to me that that period, as you mentioned in your talk, is a very complex one. Many possible scenarios can be, you know, developed. For instance, he could have learned Proclus from Alexandria. He could have been a follower of Olympiodorus. I don't know. So in
yes,
this way,
all these theories can be argued, and I think that when we talk about Dionysius and his personal philosophical or theological background, I think that whatever we say, we need to put the word probably or possibly, because basically we cannot be sure about any of this. There were, as I mentioned, Carlo Maria Mazzucchi, a very famous philologist from Milan. He identified Dionysius with Damascius, who was the head of the Academy of Athens. And there were other attempts to do similar, but we simply cannot know. We cannot be sure.
Could we argue that Dionysius approached Neoplatonism through a Christian, let us say, Origenian lens? There are some passages where you find the thought of Origen, you know, connected with pagan, the pagan Platonism and Proclus, I say.
I guess yes, because obviously he knew quite well the thinkers that preceded him, both Christian and pagan, but I'm not sure that this kind of knowledge of Neoplatonists that he displays in the corpus was mediated. My idea is I'm more inclined to think that this kind of knowledge was immediate in terms that he was in direct contact with some of the Neoplatonists, whether through the Academy of Athens or somewhere else. I cannot be sure.
Could we say that if he had an Origenian understanding of Christianity, let's say, he thought of Proclus as part of Christianity, as, let's say, preparatio evangelica or something like that, that what is good from Proclus could have been part of his own synthesis as a Christian thinker, or that the
No, I
Greeks.
don't think he had anything against Neoplatonists or against the Greeks. I mean, that is one part of the tradition of those times. Let's remember Clement of Alexandria and his appreciation of Greek wisdom and basically of everything that can be, so to say, useful for Christianity. So I don't think that he had anything against the philosophical schools, and I do think that he decided to use what he can use in corpus without, let's say, prejudices or something like that.
Great. Well, I think thank you, Dr. Ivanovic. Thank you, Demetrios, for those questions.
Thank you kindly, Philip.
Yeah, that's really enriching our discussion. That's wonderful. So thank you again, Dr. Ivanovic, for coming. Obviously, there's so much more we could talk about. So maybe one day we could have another discussion. It would be really nice.
Yeah, we can think of that. So, but for now, I say thank you very much and best of luck in your work.
Thank you, Professor. Appreciate it.
Thank you.